Hey, it's Charlie here, and I'm going to go over the 3000 GT transmission and hydraulic system for your clutch. I'm going to talk about how it's supposed to work, some of the common problems you can run into, the different adjustment points, wear items to inspect, and I'm going to talk about some other things that you should probably upgrade at the same time if you ever got to pull a transmission or do any kind of this work. So let's dig in. Let's talk about how the current system works. You've got your clutch pedal. You're going to push that in. That's going to move this linkage. It's going to push this little P-tone out through the firewall. That's going to go into the master cylinder. The clutch master cylinder is going to push hydraulic fluid out through a hard line. That hard line comes out over there, runs along the firewall, comes out down here, and that's where it ends. Then a soft line connects to that, and it brings it over to the transmission itself, goes through another mini hard line into the slave cylinder. That fluid gets moved here. It pushes this rod out into the clutch fork. That clutch fork pivots on this pivot ball. When that pivots, it takes a throwout bearing and it pushes it this way. The throwout bearing spins because the clutch will be spinning. That throwout bearing will push on these fingers of the pressure plate. That'll move the whole thing back away from the flywheel, which will take pressure off of this clutch disc. With that clutch disc not having pressure, it's not going to be engaged against the flywheel. And the flywheel is what bolts to the crankshaft of the motor, and the clutch is what transitions power from the motor to the drivetrain. So let's talk about what to look for if you've got kind of a dragging clutch issue. And a dragging clutch issue is just what it sounds. It's like the clutch is still kind of partially engaged even though you've got the pedal pushed in. There's a real simple, easy, proven test that you can do. Bring your car somewhere where there's a perfectly flat surface, take the e-brake off, put it in neutral, and take your foot off the brake, and just see if the car wants to stay where it is. You don't want it rolling forward or backwards. If it stays put, push the clutch in, put it in first gear, keep the clutch pushed in, rev it, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 RPM. Make sure that the car wants to stay right where it is. If it wants to slowly kind of move forward when you're revving it, that means your clutch is dragging. And a dragging clutch isn't good. It's not good for your transmission or the synchros inside it. And we don't want that. So let's talk about the different adjustment points and kind of wear items to look for. So the first is the clutch pedal assembly. And there's this adjustment right here. You can get to this inside the car. If you poke your head up there, 12 millimeter nut, you can break loose, and then you can grab this spline area with a pair of pliers, and you can turn this in or out to give yourself more travel. So that's the first adjustment point. There technically is an adjustment point on the end of this pedal assembly. This is what pokes through the firewall. You could loosen that up and move it, but I wouldn't recommend that, and I'll circle back to this and tell you why. There's the master cylinder. So there's no adjustment here, but they can fail. They can start leaking. You may not see a pool of brake fluid underneath your car when they do leak. So it may not be completely obvious, but typically when they do leak, you can have a little bit of fluid running down the firewall or even inside the car. If you poke your head up under there on this clutch booster, you'll see kind of a wet fluidy area. Maybe even on the rubber firewall mat inside the car, you'll see some oily fluid running on that. And that's typically a sign of a bad brake master cylinder. The hard line running to the trans and the soft line, those don't usually have issues. Slave cylinder is the exact same thing, this could leak, right? And you may not see fluid on top of your trans here. It may look kind of clean, or it may just look grubby, and the whole trans looks grubby, so it may not stand out. But if you grab the actual boot and squeeze it or pull it off like this one is, you may have some fluid drip out. And a leaky slave is the same kind of problem as a leaky master. That fluid is under pressure. That pressure is needed to disengage this clutch. And if you press it in and it slowly starts to lose that pressure, you're going to have a dragging clutch. There are some wear points on the clutch fork. And let me pull this off. And the pivot ball. So this pivot ball that can wear, it can start to flatten on the end, even where the clutch fork rides on it. I'm going to pull this throwout bearing off to show you. This rocks here, there can be wear there. So when I pull this off, all right, so right here, that's what it rocks on. And you can see it's a curved surface. This doesn't look that bad, but on some cars with higher mileage, that can start to flatten out, or you'll get like a divot in the center. That's a wear item. And on the pressure plate itself, so where that throwout bearing rides, right here you see the shiny ring. That's got a little bit of indentation where the metal wears away, and you can see it, and you can also feel it. So that's probably a few thousandths of an inch, but it's technically it technically can matter, or it makes a slight difference. But chances are, if you're running into hydraulic problems and you don't want to pull your trans to inspect all that stuff, but you know your master's not leaking, you know your slave's not leaking, you know your clutch isn't at the end of its life cycle, it's probably your pedal assembly. And I said I was going to circle back to this. And what can happen is you've got these two studs. Those go through the firewall. And on the other side of the firewall, the master goes on it. Two nuts go. It clamps the firewall, sandwiches it in place. And then inside the car, the back of it is held up with a single 12 millimeter bolt. So I'm going to flip this around, set it over the edge actually. So inside the car, so this would actually be facing up, you'll have a single 12 millimeter bolt right here holding the back of that assembly up and clamping it in place. This bolt can loosen up. And when this bolt loosens up, the only thing holding this in is these two studs. And over time, this metal can actually bend. So you can see it's kind of got a little bit of curve here, so it can bend here. It'll stretch, and then right here, this makes a nice kind of L. This can bend. And when that starts to bend, this P-tone doesn't stick out as far as it should. And that takes some of your travel away, and you may not be able to compensate for it anywhere else to make up that difference. And I don't have a bad clutch booster anymore. I did, and I wish I had kept it just for this purpose, but I did have some pictures, and that's the next best thing. So right here is a bad clutch pedal assembly, and see how this is curved, right? That's bad. That should be straight, just like this one, and just like the real one I just showed you here. And then look here, this was that L-shaped bracket, right? It's not much of an L. It's bent away from there probably 1/4 of an inch. And it shouldn't be like that. It should be a nice L. So when that happened, look at the difference. Here's that straight one on the top. See how far that pin sticks out? Here's the bent one. You can see it's bent here. That pin's only sticking out about half as far as this one. And it's because this bracket is bent, and this whole arm assembly should be more forward than it is, making this pin stick out where it should be. So that could be your issue. It was my issue on a Stealth that I had. I'd replaced pretty much everything else. And we're still having kind of some hard shifting, a dragging clutch issue, and it was the pedal assembly. On my 3000 GT, this one's got 65,000 miles. I got under there and I tightened that bolt a little bit more. So it wasn't loose, but I could still tighten it a little bit. And I would recommend checking yours and seeing if you can tighten it a little bit, because you don't want to run into this problem. You don't want to put excess wear on your trans if you have this problem. And you should be able to, with a long 1/4 inch extension, 1/4 inch ratchet, 12 millimeter socket, not a deep socket, you should be able to get under the dash and put it up there and slide the socket on that bolt and tighten it. And if you can't, or you can't see the bolt because the bracket is bent, that's bad, and it means your bracket's bent if you can't see the bolt, or maybe you see half of it, or you can't get the socket on it. That's not good. You probably have a bent bracket and you'll have to take the thing out. And it's also a pain to get the bolt out when there's a bent bracket, because you've got a wall here, you've got a wall here, you've got a wall here, and you can't really get into it very well from this side, and you can't get a socket on it straight on. And the bolt that's in there isn't going to have this Phillips head on it. It's going to be a normal bolt without the Phillips head on it. And I found a crow's foot worked for me on the Stealth. I was able to get it loosened up a little bit more. And then I was able to take a long regular screwdriver and kind of play the game where you just keep poking at it a little bit on the head since it was loose, and slowly back it out of there. And then I replaced it. I didn't try straightening anything. I'm sure you could, if you disassembled everything, you'd be able to bend it back to where it should be. But I didn't want to mess around with that. And that's why I say that this adjustment point probably never needs to be adjusted, because they adjust that at the factory when the car was made. The firewall's in the same spot as it was when the car was made. This bolts up against it just as tight as it was when the car was made. So there shouldn't be any reason for you to make this adjustment. And if you are adjusting this, you're probably compensating for something else, either a bent bracket or a leaky slave or master, or worn pivot ball or worn clutch fork. You shouldn't have to touch that, and it's a pain to get to anyways. It's not something that I would want to adjust if I didn't have to. It doesn't hurt to inspect it if you've already got it apart. Maybe you're replacing your master. There is a OEM specification on doing that. Here it is in the service manual. It looks like that should stick out 0.21 to 0.46 millimeters. But again, if you don't have to do that, don't do it. And if you're not having problems, double, triple check that bolt. Just snug it down a little bit more. I bet yours is loose. Even if you're not having problems, I bet you'll be able to tighten that a little bit more. And I don't think there's anything else that you should have to adjust to compensate for if your pedal's fine and everything else is fine. I know people have added like a thick washer behind the pivot ball to shim it a little bit, to give the clutch fork a little bit more travel. You could probably do the same thing on the slave cylinder if you added a washer between this flange and the other one. But you shouldn't have to with everything else working as it should. So let's talk about some other things that you should look at or inspect if you're pulling your trans, or maybe you've still got shifting problems. Maybe your hydraulic lines are great, and you've just checked everything I just mentioned, but you're still having issues getting it into gear. One thing I would inspect is right here. See that white thing? It may not be white on your car. It may be covered in grease, and you may not be able to see it. I've cleaned it off a little bit. That's called the select lever shoe, and it's a piece of plastic. It's a square cube, and when the shifter when your car goes forward or backwards, right, this is what happens. This goes up or down. And that select lever shoe is a big part of that. And if that gets worn or cracked or broke or is missing, or the center part of it gets worn because it's got a little hollow cutout in the center that a little ketone rides in, this little back of here, that sticks out the other side. There's a hollow spot. If that gets play in it, it may not be going up or down as far as it should. This one is, like, I can pull that back. I can't lift it up anymore, and I can see that when it goes down all the way. But that little select lever shoe is something to look at. And the part number is a pain to find. It's not something that Google really helps you with, but I have it written down right here. MD712919. It's like $2 or $3 from the dealer. I'd recommend inspecting that. Change your output shaft seal, especially if it's leaking or if it hasn't been done recently. Get an OEM seal. That's easy to do when the trans is out. It's impossible to do when the trans is in, at least on a 6-speed. Even if you could somehow get that out, you wouldn't be able to slide it off because it would hit the teeth of the flywheel. So replace that, especially if it's leaking. Inspect your fork. I like to replace them just because they can get wear. If your clutch sends you a throwout bearing, say you order like an ACT clutch, and they send you a throwout bearing with it, I typically won't run them. I'll run an OEM coil throwout bearing. I'm not even sure. I don't even think this is an OEM bearing that was on this car. But the coils seem to work well. I've had an ACT bearing fail after about 8,000 miles, and it's not fun pulling your trans a second time. This rubber line that runs from the firewall to the trans, they make aftermarket stainless steel braided ones. They don't want to swell. They're a little bit stiffer. I would replace that. It's like $20, $30. On the actual transmission itself, there's this bracket that the shifter cables go through, and this is held on with some rubber bushings here. They make aftermarket ones that are aluminum that really makes this bracket solid, or some people use washers. That's what someone did here. They use some washers, so it's on here solid. It's not going to move around. Same for the shifter bushings on the shifter cables. They make aluminum ones versus the stock rubber ones. That'll get rid of some play and slop. So there's 2 here. Even inside the car, there's 2 as well. The one that goes over here, not a lot of people replace. I don't even know if they make an aftermarket one. It's a much smaller bushing, but this one is the same style as under the hood, or maybe I got it switched around. But one of these you can replace with an aluminum bushing. Same here for the actual mounts on the shifter base. If you ever pull your shift boot and grab your shift lever and you shine a flashlight down there and you move this over to the left or the right, you're going to see your shifter base wobble a little. I like to get rid of these rubber bushings and put aluminum ones in. The aluminum ones are nice because they're CNC'd and they'll center perfectly. You could use a few thick washers, and I have done that in the past, but the aluminum bushings are like $20 or so off eBay. And there's no messing around with them with washers. There's no trying to stack 2 or 3 washers under this and then get everything bolted down versus just one bushing under it. So I'd highly recommend those. It just makes the shifter feel a lot more solid and a lot more enjoyable to use. One thing else I would probably recommend is a vacuum assist. So this nipple right here is for the clutch vacuum assist. It means when the car is running and pulling vacuum, it makes the clutch pedal slightly easier to to push in, which is great. You want that. But what you don't really need or want is the metal hard line that they use. So right here, you can see this hard line comes all the way over, comes down to this canister looking thing underneath the car. It bolts to this cross member. You can remove that. The purpose of this is to store vacuum. So if you turn your car off and you go have lunch and you come back and you push your clutch pedal in to start the car, when you push that clutch pedal in, it's using that stored vacuum to make it slightly easier to push in as you're starting the car. And you don't need that. You're not going to notice the difference. It's much more aesthetically pleasing to remove that, and you can get rid of that hard line that runs here. You'll notice it runs like extremely close to your battery terminal. You can remove all that. You can remove the canister under the car. It's probably rusted out anyways, unless it's a later year 3s, which they switched to plastic. And you have to reroute some of your lines. So if you followed the actual hard line that your clutch master comes out of, it comes up here. It goes underneath this AC bracket, and it comes out here. And it normally continues. You can chop that off right here, and then you're gonna have a Y basically. So this manifold port on your intake manifold, it comes out. There's a check valve in here. It loops around and it comes out to right here. So this is that same hard line. This hard line comes up here, and this is where it tees. So this side of the T comes right back here to your clutch booster, and that other side comes out to what you just cut. And you can put a hose over the end you cut off, and that'll wrap around to your brake booster right here. So your brake pedal and your clutch pedal both see vacuum, and it makes them easier to push in when the car is running. They're both fed off this one source, and you just eliminated that entire hard line and canister under your car. So that'll clean things up. Make sure this hose right here, make sure you have the check valve right. You don't want it, you don't want boost to be able to go through this hose. You want to, if you blow in from this end, you want it to stop. You don't want to feel air coming out the other way. You want to be able to go the opposite way. You want to be able to suck in from this end but not blow. And that'll clean things up. And if you ever do have to pull this, right, it's a pain to get to. You can visually see how much of a pain it would be. But you got to undo these AC lines, get them out of the way, take this nut off. That'll help lift this AC line up a little bit. You can take the 4 bolts by the brake pedal inside the car and loosen those and disconnect the linkage and pull the booster out a little bit. I don't usually back off the nuts on the bolts all the way. I'll back them all the way up so they're just grabbing on 1 or 2 threads. That way I don't pull the booster assembly all the way out. And that'll allow you to kind of get in here with an angled wrench to get the bolts unbolted for that clutch pedal assembly and to remove the master. You'll definitely want a crow's foot as well to get this metal hard line out. I'd recommend the Cenex flared fitting. So this is a 10mm flared crow's foot. That'll get on that line and you'll be able to take the nut off without worrying about stripping it. And you can get these online. They're really good quality. You can get the 10mm through 19mm kit around $30 or so on Amazon. They'll pay for themselves time and time again. So that pretty much covers everything to look for if you're gonna have your trans out. Wouldn't be a bad idea to replace the rear main seal of the engine too, since that's the only time you can really access it. Whether it's leaking or not, I usually will replace it. For the master and slave, they can be rebuilt if you don't want to ever buy a new one. I usually do try to go with OEM parts when possible. I don't know if you can still get OEM rebuild kits or not. It's been a while. But there are aftermarket companies that will sell rebuild kits. Like you could pop this clip out of this master cylinder, and you could slide the piston inside and pull it out and slide a new one in and replace that clip, and it's rebuilt. I know that the aftermarket ones, I did use an aftermarket slave cylinder. It was made by Centric, and I didn't have any problems with it, and I think it was around $30. So if you can't find OEM or OEM rebuild kits, then you don't want to pay OEM prices for a slave cylinder. Centric isn't a bad brand to buy. As far as the slave cylinders, there are two different kinds for the all-wheel drive cars. There's a blue slave cylinder that was made in 91 and maybe mid-92, and it's got a 3/4 inch bore, so the inner diameter of this is 3/4 of an inch thick, as opposed to the later style gray slave cylinders, which were 11/16 bore. So you can do some research if you want to see what the effect would be of running the other. I do know some people online that have a later style 3000 GT will run the earlier style with the bigger bore. And I think their reasoning is it makes the clutch pedal feel a little bit lighter. But I run the later style bore, the one that's meant for my car, and I don't have any problems. When it comes to an actual clutch, this one's junk obviously, but if you're ever looking at a used clutch, you can lay a straight edge across here. You want to make sure it's flat. If you're looking to buy a clutch, I would stick to a name brand for the 3000 GT. I wouldn't necessarily go to eBay and buy the cheapest one that you can find. Stuff like OEM obviously, or Exedi is good. There are a few other companies. Spec makes clutches, South Bend, RPS. Those are all kind of good brand clutches. What I run in my car is a Spec 4 Plus clutch, and the reason I run that is because it's unsprung. It's a full disc clutch, and there's no springs in the center. Some people with high horsepower applications have had the springs actually pop out, and I didn't want to have to worry about that, so I went with Spec, and it feels great. And the thing I love about it is the pedal feel. It's a little bit stiffer than stock, but it's not as stiff as like an ACT clutch or an RPS clutch. So that's kind of I'm not saying it that's why I bought the clutch. It was just kind of a nice fact that I realized after installing it. It holds well. It has a little bit of a slip to it if I'm doing a launch. It's been a great clutch. I think I have around 12,000 miles on it and 7 or 8 years old. But that's what I recommend if you're making like 500 plus horsepower. Other clutches will work. Some people like the puck clutches. Some people like the multi-disc clutches as well. The multi-disc clutches will have 2 or 3 clutch plates in them, and the clutch plates will actually clamp against each other as opposed to clamping straight against the flywheel. That can lead to a nice light pedal feel, and it can actually be a benefit for your crankshaft. You won't have a heavy-duty pressure plate pushing against the flywheel, pushing against your crankshaft, pushing against the thrust washers. A lot of Supra owners that run big turbo setups and are making some power, they could potentially run a single disc clutch with a heavy pressure plate, but people that do that can run into crank walk issues on the 2JZ motor. So a lot of them will go to a twin disc or a triple disc, some even a quad disc clutch. They won't have that problem. There's a few other things that they'll do. They'll go above the clutch pedal and they'll disconnect or connect the sensor line, so you don't need to have the clutch pedal pressed in when you start the car. And there's some driving style habits that you can get used to also help with that. Like if you're coming to a red light, put it in neutral, coast to a stop. Don't sit there holding the clutch in first gear, waiting for it to turn green. When it turns green, pop the clutch in, put it in first, and go. So hopefully this has been helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.